The 6 to 7 Figure Show, episode 42. Let's hit it.
Broadcasting from the Valley of the Sun outside Phoenix, Arizona, this is the 6 to 7 Figure Show. Tired of working so hard and having no time? Take your six-figure practice and turn it to a thriving seven-figure enterprise. And now, your host, author, speaker, mentor, and strategist, Frank Bria.
Everyone, welcome to the 6 to 7 Figure Show. I'm your host, Frank Bria, and today I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by Steve Gordon, two-time entrepreneur, author of 3 books, founder of the Unstoppable Agency, and the host of the Unstoppable CEO podcast. He's written over 400 articles on marketing for service businesses. Through his firm, he helps consultants, coaches, and agencies develop strategic business relationships through podcast interviews, which we're going to dig into a little bit today. So welcome to the show, Steve. Thanks so much for spending time with us today.
Yeah, Frank, excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So podcasts are something that I think most entrepreneurs are tripping themselves up on these days. So I would love to get, just let's start off with your thoughts on podcasts. Like, obviously, you're a podcast agency, you're working with those. Obviously, you think that they're valuable, but there are people who are definitely probably wasting their time doing this wrong. So what's the right way in your estimation for a service business to use a podcast these days?
Well, first of all, we're an accidental podcast agency.
Okay.
So, a few years ago, I was in the advice giving business. We were a marketing consulting firm, purely consulting. And you would come to us and we would give you all of these wonderful ideas on how to market your service business. And we had really happy clients who loved all of that advice and loved the strategies we were giving them, but they would go away, after one of our 90-day sessions and then come back the next 90 days. And they'd be really frustrated because they hadn't implemented very much.
Right.
And what we learned through that was that for our ideal client, they don't want to become a master marketer.
Yeah.
They didn't have the capability, they didn't have the skill, they didn't have the inclination or the team to really do it themselves. And so we started looking at all of the different strategies that we were teaching them and trying to figure out, okay, well, where are they going to have the most success in the shortest amount of time that's going to be something that they can reasonably implement, and then we can implement the, like 90 to 95% of it, and they can only, they'll show up for the 5% where we absolutely need them.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how we got to podcasting. So I was already running a podcast, I'm a big believer in the medium. And I think it's particularly useful for any business where you're selling at a high ticket and where you need a lot of trust with your prospects, because it allows you to sort of go under the radar with your marketing. And I'll explain what I mean by that. With a podcast, most people think, oh, it's internet marketing. Let's get, 100 billion people to listen, right?
Right.
And the truth is the value of the podcast is in the small numbers. And I don't mean small audience numbers, in the small numbers, meaning the people that you invite on to be a guest on the podcast, that you are able to interview so they can display all of their expertise to your network. And in the process, you're going to get the opportunity to build a really strong relationship with them and do it really quickly. And so that's when we're working with a client, we are urging them to focus on the people that they're going to interview. So they want to interview influencers and potential clients. And it's a great way to start those relationships without it being about sales.
It's interesting because I've heard recently a lot of people talking, or not a lot of people, but a few people talking about leveraging podcasts the way that you're describing it. I think for most people, as it was for me, it's a bit of a complete change in focus about podcasting, because if you go back several years, podcasting was all about building the audience and how many tens of thousands of downloads, and there was this drive towards build a big enough audience that you could sell sponsorship opportunities and things like that. And that all felt a little off to me. It all felt a little, I don't know, like trying to make yourself a superstar and this big, huge audience, which goes against pretty much what I tell everybody in marketing anyway. And so it never really quite sat. So as you've described this, and there have been others who are talking about this as well. John Corcoran, mutual friend of ours, has been talking about this style as well. It sort of makes more sense. The one thing I think is interesting about this, because you're doing it agency style now, and I'm wondering if this isn't the missing link for people, and even for me, is that the follow through has to be like really on in order to pull this off, right? This isn't just a matter of like smashing through the interviews, 5 a day style, and then having all of the recording and the technical pieces. Like this is all about relationships and follow through. How do people best get that part of this worked out? Because that seems like that's where this lives or dies.
That is absolutely where it lives or dies. I mean, you can get these days, podcast agencies are about as common as Facebook ad agencies, right? It's hard to throw a rock and not hit one. Most of them are geared towards, hey, I'll edit your audio for you and I'll post it up, into Libsyn or one of the hosting services. And that's great. There's some value there.
Sure.
That's not where you're going to make the money though. It is in the relationship. And so what we have done is we've looked at end to end. If, Frank, if you're one of our clients and you're going to invite a high profile guest on that you want to have a business relationship with, so how can we front load that feeling that they're going to have about you and make it so that they feel that Frank is the coolest guy in the world before they get on the interview.
Right.
And then when you're in the call, how can we coach you and teach you to start a conversation that's going to open the door to business opportunities, not immediately on that call, but it'll give you the fodder to be able to follow up later and see how you can add value to them. And then, the strategic byproduct of the podcast are all these interviews that you're doing, and those make for great nurture content down the road. And so we've really kind of built an end-to-end process there.
Yeah. And it doesn't surprise me at all that for you, the relationship and the long-term is the play. I mean, you still have probably one of the best infrastructures I've seen for generating referrals, which is all again about relationship building and making sure you have the long-term play. This is interesting. I find that a lot of entrepreneurs don't have the patience to do what you're talking about. There's a lot of people really want the quick pop. We talk about Facebook ad agencies. There's this attitude of, well, if I just spend $100 this week, I should generate, $3,000 in the next 14 days. And if I don't, then I'm doing the wrong thing and I got to pop up and do something else.
That stuff is all great if you're selling a relatively commoditized, easy to buy, easy to understand product.
Sure.
If you're selling a highly complicated and very expensive, meaning, high 4 to 5 to 6 and 7 figures, which is really, that's my background. I came from owning a technical firm. Our contracts were minimum 5 figures. Most of the time we were, a single contract would be 6 and 7 figures.
Right.
We were playing a long game, just the necessity of it.
Right.
And so I've kind of spent the last 25 years of my career trying to reverse engineer that sales process. And so, no, it's not overnight, but if you're in this kind of business, we've really looked at it long and hard, and we'll accelerate that process for you.
So share with us a couple of the big mistakes you're seeing people make with podcasts these days. What are some of the gotchas that are kind of keeping people from making this pay off for them long-term?
So first and foremost is to focus on audience growth, and that I'm going to get sponsorships and all that. And I actually it hasn't been published as we're recording this, but I just recorded last week an episode breaking down the sponsorship numbers. And to get to 6 figures in sponsorship numbers, you've got to be, in the top 10% or top 20% of all podcasts in terms of number of downloads, like multiple tens of thousands of downloads an episode.
Yeah.
and that's a really hard thing to control. So that's the first big mistake, is to focus on that. Don't focus on that. The second mistake we see, and this is something that we're always sort of coaching our clients on, is there are a lot of people that that are going to be easy guests to get, but you want the strategic guests.
Right.
And you need to put some thought into who would be a good strategic guest for you. And they fall into two categories. One would be an influencer, or you might call them a referral partner, that is, marketing to the same group of people that you're marketing to. And this is a great way. Like, if you've ever done traditional referral marketing where you had those coffee dates, or you went to lunch and you walked out and you said, hey, we're going to have this great mutually beneficial relationship, and then nothing happened.
Right.
And you felt bad about that. You left and you're like, I got to do all this work to get them like a specific referral to a specific person. This is a much easier way to give value to them. And so it's a much more approachable way. So that's the first thing, is be really strategic about who you invite on, because that's going to determine how successful you are with it. The other is one of the mistakes we're really beginning to see is that if you only do interviews, then you miss an important marketing opportunity. And there are really three types of episodes that you want to have. So you want to have interviews with the two types of people we just talked about. You want to have interviews with your clients who are having a lot of success working with you, because those turn into fantastic case studies and they make your client feel really good.
Right.
That's always good. And you need some where it's just you explaining what we would call your worldview. In other words, for every service provider I've ever talked to, they have in their mind, this is how we do it here and why it's 100 times better than what anybody else is doing, right? We sort of have that little arrogant sort of, I'm better. I'm a little bit better than everybody else, right?
Right.
Well, that's a good thing, because you need that kind of worldview or that point of view. And the podcast gives you a platform to get it out there without you having to write. And I find that the act of writing is a big, big barrier for a lot of business owners. And so this allows you to get up there with an outline and talk through it just the way you talk with a potential client.
That's really interesting. So is there like a format or a frequency you're finding in terms of episodes that works the best?
So in terms of overall frequency, we generally will recommend weekly.
Okay.
We've got 3 packages that we offer: every weekday, a weekly, and every other week. And I almost try and tell people, don't take the week, or don't take the daily. Too much work. You're going to burn out. It's going to be too hard. Weekly is a good frequency, so you're showing up every week. It keeps you focused and kind of in the rhythm of it. And there is a good long-term byproduct to having these episodes out there, that you get a lot more benefit from weekly. You get twice as many interviews, twice as many relationships, but the back catalog will begin to sell for you as you get beyond the 6-month mark. So you've got this pile of episodes built up. You've shared your worldview. You've interviewed interesting people and sounded really smart while you interviewed them. You've got these great long-form case studies from your clients. And then a prospect stumbles into your world, starts listening to the podcast. They realize, oh, wait, you've got 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 episodes in that catalog. So they start binge listening. And as they do that, they sell themselves on you. You get to build trust with them over time.
Right. So it's the trust and credibility that comes. It's interesting because I think that the fact that you talk about this mix of medium between interview and being able to teach your own content, it almost goes against the original, lots of folks who had this, you're either an interview format or you're a content format, and ne'er the two shall meet. It seems like that it almost goes against sort of that adage of, are you going to be the person who sort of collects the great content and presents it? You're the curator as the interviewer, or you're doing the content itself. And it's interesting that your recommendation is to find a nice mix of both.
Well, I started off thinking with our own podcast, thinking, okay, it's an interview show and it needs to be an interview show. Yeah. Then I got to a point where I hadn't paid attention to booking very many interviews and I had to do some solo episodes. And so it happened to be around the time when we were, I was coming out with a new book. And so I did a 3-part series on the book content, and we got great feedback on it. I thought, okay, well, there's a good ad. And then a few months later, we happened to do several clients, and we got great feedback on that. And we actually closed business after those went out directly from those. I thought, okay. I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I do observe things.
You can sense when something's working, when the money's coming in.
Right. Yeah.
That's nice. Well,
so that's how we came to that.
I do think a lot of people, this is monetizing podcasts is a really tough thing to struggle. I want to pivot a little bit into your particular service offering because and change the topic just ever so slightly. Because a lot of people who run agencies or do a lot of marketing support services like you're doing are running into trouble with growth. They just get maxed out. They can't take on any more clients. We have a lot of people in touch with us that's their big thing. In fact, so much so that they want to give up doing services for other people and move into some other sort of more ethereal service offering so that they can expand their offering. What are some of the things that you're doing right now to kind of push through that problem to grow, even though you're providing marketing services directly to your clients?
Well, I think it's important to understand why we pivoted in this direction. So, I started thinking back to my first business, which we had these really long relationships with clients. I exited that business, and when I did, the business had been around for 25 years, and we still had client number 1. And that was a pretty profitable client relationship for us. And I think our youngest client was around 5 years old at that point. And so I started thinking in terms of how do I recreate that? And I think the best way that you recreate that, it's not the only way, but I think the best way you recreate that is you find a job that your ideal client needs done and needs done repeatedly over time, but is either difficult for them to do or one that's undesirable for them to do. And then you go figure it out. And so that's kind of how we got to that point. Now, every business that tries to do that is going to run into these inflection points where, and it all has to do with the systems that you've built. So when you start off, you're sort of just seat of your pants trying to figure it all out, right? And that scales to a handful of clients, and then you hit that ceiling. And now you've got to put systems in place and probably a couple of team members, or at least one. And then you max them out and the systems you have, and you keep running into this. And then what I found is by the time you get to somewhere close to around needing, between 8 and 10 people, you got a choice to make. And you're either going to step back and devise systems that allow it to then scale. I hate to say infinitely, because I think that's a foolish word to throw around.
Sure.
But scale far beyond where you are, whether you choose to do that or not, or you're going to be right there. And if you stay stuck right there, your experience in the business is going to be, it's going to be bumpy because you're constantly hitting your head against that ceiling because you haven't figured out those systems. And so that tends to be where I see it happen. So we actually hit that point at the end of last year. And I knew we were going to get there. It was kind of intentional. We grew enough to get to that point so that I had enough revenue that I could then hire an operations manager. And then that which freed me up to then start focusing on what's the production system and what's the people system going to look like to take us now beyond something that's repeatable. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. And I think, so you really summed it up really well just with the phrase step back. It requires you as the entrepreneur to step back and realize that you're moving from this sense of managing tasks to managing systems. Like you have to make this decision that you're going to be changing what you do. And for some people that just That's horrible. Like, that's awful. I mean, you and I have talked about this because we kind of share this engineering background a little bit. So systems and processes are kind of cool stuff. But for a lot of people, it's like you might as well have dropped raw liver on their plate for dinner. Like, they absolutely can't do that at all. And so that's not a business model they're going to be comfortable with. But if you want to do this successfully, you really do have to step back. It's really funny. In so many of the companies that I did consulting work for, growing tech companies and such, and in the high tech space, as much as the company wanted to talk about planning for growth and systems, in almost every single case, you had to force everybody into it by basically just outselling the systems so that they would be forced to build the systems. I remember one CEO told me, he's like, there's no way to motivate everybody better than sticking more business on their plate than they know what to do with their existing framework.
They'll figure it out.
Develop it. Yeah.
Yeah. You got to work through it.
Right.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that, again, as I reflected back on how we were able to do this with this first company. So, we were building subdivisions and incredibly complex, and having to put houses on lots and make sure they were oriented the right way. And I'm, really thankful that we were able to put about 5,000 houses in the ground, and only one of them did we ever had an error on. So we had to live by systems.
Yep.
And we weren't exactly, for some of that work, we were hiring people that barely had a high school education to do some of the most critical stuff. And so we had to have processes that were fairly bulletproof. And the model there, that we used to scale that was this idea of a crew, or kind of a pod of people. Each person had kind of their own role to play, and we sort of segmented off the work that way. And I think for a lot of businesses, they get caught up in, well, how am I going to staff this? Because they haven't thought about how to segment the work to the people. And that becomes a real barrier. And so if you can think in terms of, well, how do I break? I've got this small little team of people, and I need one that does this, and one that does that, and one that does the next thing. And if you can define one of those, you now have the blueprint for scaling it. Because now you're just, just like you would in a factory, put another machine in, you're just putting another pod of people in.
Yep. I think that you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, this is something that we talk about all the time with our clients, is if you have a process, or you have some kind of a output that needs to get done, and you can't identify the skill sets of the people, you can't break them down into component pieces, then you haven't thought it through well enough. Mm-hmm. And so many small companies sort of exist on this idea of, well, I'll just hire another sort of superstar with general skill sets that'll be able to, and you just can't scale that way. It just doesn't work. And
it's a crapshoot, first of all, because there aren't that many superstars.
Right.
And
if there were, why are they're not going to be working for you long term, probably.
Yeah. And you can't afford to pay them most of the time. I mean, they're going to eat all your profit. You know this, you're an expert at this more than I am. And, and so I just don't think that's the way to do it. Again, reflecting back to that first business, we were able to grow that pretty rapidly and become an industry leader by hiring the lower end folks that I just talked about. And then to manage them and do the higher end work, we were hiring fresh out of college graduates and basically turning over work to them that at most of our competitors, they wouldn't have given that to somebody until they'd been there 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we had the systems and processes, the guardrails in place that work great.
Yep. And, at least in the work you were doing with houses, the cost of failure is pretty high. So you got to get those.
Yeah. You paid attention.
down pretty good. We are running out of time, Steve. So I want to ask you one last question. And we've talked a little around this, but I want you to be real specific for our guests here. But what kind of business and at what point in growth is it time to start a podcast like you're talking about? How does it, if a business owner's listening to this, how do they know this is right for them and that the time is right?
Yeah. So and I think of this not so much in terms of the podcast, it's when do you need to begin getting serious about your marketing. So for most service businesses, when they get started, there's a lot of hustle involved to get the early stage clients. The business owner gets to about, 6 figures or somewhere between 100 and 200,000 in personal income. And they're looking to grow beyond that. And most of the time our clients are, somewhere in that range or above, and they have maxed out on the amount of time that they can spend on business development. And now they need a way that begins to scale, and they don't want to become a master marketer. And that's where the podcast comes in. It's not that podcasting is somehow magical, but it is a really time efficient and leveraged way for an entrepreneur that doesn't want to become a full-time marketer to get really, really good marketing done. And that's usually the right place for that to plug in.
Yeah. And you brought up a really good point, which I think it's missed a lot in our industry, which is, as the entrepreneur, if you're a service provider, unless marketing's your thing and you are in a marketing business, it does not make any sense at all to become a marketer. And it's so frustrating because it seems like in the lead generation space that there's so many offerings out there to train people to become marketers. And it's like that, again, because you and I, again, share this background coming in from a non-digital marketing space and working in other industries. Like I keep telling people I would never imagine myself walking into the office of a CEO of some Fortune 500 company and tell him or her, oh, by the way, you're going to need to start an advertising campaign, and I suggest you take a course that trains you on how to do that. It just is ridiculous.
And, for the types of people that you're working with, Frank, where you're teaching them how to build this program and make it scalable, where they deliver value is not in marketing what they do. Where they deliver value is in getting the result and designing the systems to deliver the result for the client. That's what they're getting paid for. That's where they need to focus.
Right.
Yeah, the marketing still got to happen, just like the bookkeeping still got to happen, and the accounting and the legal stuff and all of that. Get an expert.
Yeah.
Whether it's me, you, somebody else, get an expert.
Yep. And it is frustrating. I remember just personally as a last little anecdote, I was working on a system where I needed sort of referral partners. And I went out to somebody and said, hey, I just need to hire somebody who's going to go out and recruit referral partners for me. And the person said, well, we're kind of busy, but I've got a course on this. And I'm like, if you're busy, imagine I'm busy. I'm going to take your course to learn how to do this. It was so frustrating that there's this like knee-jerk reaction.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely. Anyway, Steve, it's been great. Thanks so much. We're out of time, and I know you're super busy. But just as a last point, for those people who are listening to you and are interested in hearing more about what you guys are up to in terms of how you feel like podcasts are useful and the relationships you build with them, where's a good place for people to go to kind of get started and learning more about what you guys do?
Yeah, so we've actually put up a page just for your listeners. And when they go there, they're going to be able to find a link to our podcast if they want to tune in and listen to that. We'd love to have you as a listener. But you can get a copy there of a book that I wrote last year called The Exponential Network Strategy. And that book really describes how our approach to podcasting works. And so you can read it, and then you can decide I'm either going to implement this myself, or I'm going to go find a team to do it that I'm going to hire, and put them on my team internally. Or if you want to work with us, great. There's a link there as well where you could book a call. And then also we've got, we'll have a short little list of some other resources that'll be helpful for the folks listening. So they can go to unstoppableceo.net/HTP. So unstoppableceo.net/HTP.
Great. And that link's below the video here, or if you're listening audio, the show notes page. If you happen to be out and about listening to this, come on back to the show notes page too and click on through if you didn't catch that. Thanks much, Steve, for that offer. That's terrific. A terrific offer for the audience. And I'll just add in there as a tag. I know you were equivocating a little bit on different ways to do stuff, but you'd be smart to just hire somebody to execute this for you rather than try to figure this out yourself. But I understand where
that's what we think, but you know,
of course. Steve, thanks so much. I really appreciate the time. It's been great information. And I think for a lot of people who have been looking at podcasts and trying to figure out, how is the what's the sort of key to unlocking the power and potential of format? You've given a lot of really good advice. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Frank. It's been fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for being here with us on the 6 to 7 Figure Show. I've been your host, Frank Bria. And thanks again. We know that you're busy and got lots of stuff to do. So if you're taking the time with us, we're honored that you've given us a little bit of a spot in your schedule. And we'll see you on the next episode. All right, take care. Bye-bye.